I think we've got everything set up technically, so we will begin the event. My name is Doug Brown. I'm co-chair of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War here in Hamilton. Also I'm a co-host of Unusual Sources, which some of you may have heard on CFMU Radio weekly at 5 o'clock every Wednesday. Well, the first thing is, thanks so much for coming out. This is a marvelous turnout. And by attending this event, you're defending free speech, because we've had problems renting a room, and so it's very important that we maintain the right for free speech and to be able to hold public meetings without obstruction. We've had several meetings in this very venue over the last few years on Syria, and these events have always been very civil and respectful, so I'm hoping that continues tonight. Unfortunately, there have been attempts made to deny us a location for this event, I'm going to deal with that right now. We know that there's very different opinions about Syria, and the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War believes that all Canadians need to be involved. We think it is the duty of all Canadians to comment on the foreign policy of Canada, especially when it is so destructive about Syria. This is exactly what we plan to do at this meeting. Okay, so I'm calling the meeting to order. And first of all, I acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Mississauga nations. A little bit about the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. We were formed 16 years ago, actually, in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq. And I think all of us wish we didn't have to continue, because, you know, that was the first of a series of wars that, have plagued the planet. And we have continued to work to stop that war and all following wars. Before I introduce Reverend Sloan and our speaker, Eva Bartlett, I'd want to lay out some ground rules for the next 2 hours. The emphasis will be on mutual respect. So again, we recognize that there are people here with very different opinions, but we insist that respect guide our dialogue. That means that Eva will speak for about 45 minutes without taking or answering questions. And then when she finishes, there will be a fundraising appeal from Ken Stone, and then and some announcements, and then we'll begin a question and answer. So we have a number of ushers here today. They have armbands on. You can see them fairly clearly. And for the question and answer, they all have these yellow cards. So if you want to make a comment or if you want to ask a question, please get a yellow card from one of the ushers and put it down, write as clearly as you can, please. You can identify yourself and your affiliation, or you can leave it anonymous. That's your choice. And once the question and answer begins, we will answer the questions as they are received. So it's sort of first come, first serve. And we'll continue to answer questions in order and until we come to 9 o'clock, and that's when the event has to finish. Okay, I hope this doesn't come into effect, but in the event that someone is disorderly or disrespectful, I will call him or her to order. If they continue to behave disrespectfully, I'll ask the ushers to deal with them. And if the behavior continues, that person will be asked to leave. So we're determined to show respect for all attendees here by having Eva's talk proceed tonight. Okay, so a few other things. We're sharing the church with members of NGen, the youth group that shares this building, and we welcome any of them that might have come in. The Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War extends our thanks to New Vision United Church for use of the room, and we ask Reverend Ian Sloan to say a few words of welcome.
Welcome everyone. This is New Vision United Church, and we recognize that we're on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee. We are a congregation of the United Church of Canada, and as a local United Church of Canada, we have a fair amount of autonomy ourselves, which we cherish, we value, and we celebrate. One of the things that we have done is put together a statement or an affirmation of inclusion, which I think for tonight's meeting would be apropos for me to share with you. So let me do that. The New Vision Affirmation of Inclusion. We affirm the inclusion of people of every ability, income level, age, gender, race, family type, gender identity, and sexual orientation in the membership, ministry, leadership, and life of this congregation. We celebrate the gifts and graces of all people. You're all welcome here today, this evening. New Vision has opened its space up to the Coalition to Stop the War for this talk. I'm looking forward to hearing Eva speak, and I'm looking forward to the questions and answers that come afterwards. I'll say something that probably won't surprise you, and that's that New Vision United Church isn't hosting this event, nor is it endorsing any views that are shared here this evening. But in the spirit of being part of civil society in Canada, we recognize these sorts of events to be very important to the health of our communities. And so, welcome Doug, welcome Eva. I think she's over there. And I'll look forward to the proceedings.
Oh, I'm taking everything. You took everything. Okay, so thank you, Reverend Sloan. Eva Bartlett, our speaker tonight, she has some of you, I know some of you know of her, and I just wanted to go through some of her background and accomplishments. First of all, Eva is an independent Canadian rights and justice activist and a freelance journalist. And she's spent years in occupied Palestine documenting Zionist crimes against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and volunteering with the International Solidarity Movement. In 2008, Eva sailed with the 3rd Free Gaza Movement boat from Cyprus to the Gaza Strip, and where she then joined the International Solidarity Movement in accompanying fishermen on the sea and farmers on the border regions in the Gaza Strip. In both cases, fishers and farmers were violently attacked by the Israeli army, injured, killed, or abducted, and she doesn't mention it here, but I'm sure that she was very much at risk to do this. She was also in Gaza during the Cast-Lead operation and witnessed the results of that attack on Gaza. During the 2012 attacks, Eva documented from a central Gaza Strip hospital. More recently, in 2014, Eva visited Syria for a period of a month, taking testimonies of Syrian and Palestinian victims of terrorism in the Yarmouk camp, as well as in Homs, Kasab, and Latakia. And she's experienced firsthand the effect of terrorist murders on Damascus, including being shot at by a terrorist sniper. So, and just now, she was in Syria just, 6-7 weeks ago? In November. So, and since that time, she has toured North America. She's just beginning a Canadian tour. She has also given talks across Ireland and in Britain as well. And you can get more information on Eva at theingaza.wordpress.com. So please welcome our speaker, Eva Bartlett.
Thank you very much, and thank you for opening the space to us tonight. I really appreciate that. While I'm just making some notes, I wonder if our tech guy could help me just set up the projector to the computer, because I sometimes have trouble pairing it. So he said he was going to move there. Anyway, so let's see. I'm going to try to remember some of Doug's remarks. Most of which he said was true. In 2008-9, I was in Gaza, and I was riding in ambulances with the Palestinian Red Crescent Society to document the worst of the Zionist war crimes. And with regard to being with farmers and fishers, the reasons for doing that is because on a daily basis they're shot at by armed Israeli soldiers, even though the fishers and the farmers are clearly unarmed. And it's one of many policies the Israelis use against Palestinians to render them, devoid of income and to be dependent on UN handouts. There's something else he said I was going to address, but I forget what it was now. But yeah, I'm an activist, I am a freelance writer, and I want to address just a few things because I think people might have heard claims that I work for Russia. I have contributed since I think 2014. I don't remember the exact date when I first wrote an opinion piece for Russia Today's op-ed section, which is an opinion section. But if it was 2014 or 13, maybe 2012, since then I've written a total of 8 opinion pieces, which I submitted to them and they accepted. And the other thing I want to note is in that opinion section of Russia Today, there are over 70 contributors. And you might be aware of the name of John Pilger. He also contributes to Russia Today. So just to note, people can contribute to different newspapers, opinion pieces or articles, and not necessarily be an agent of that country. And the other thing I just note in terms of lexicon, why is Robert Fisk not an agent of Britain? He writes for the Independent. So I also contribute to non-paying sites like Dissident Voice and sites that pay very little, like SOTT.net or American Herald Tribune, or in the past I used to contribute to Counterpunch, and that was completely non-paying. So the point I'm making is that what I do is I try to write the information as I believe to be true, as told to me by whether it's Palestinians or Syrians that I'm meeting with. So that's my objective in this, to convey. The other thing I want to say is, tonight is not about my opinion about Syria. I'm not an expert, and I make that clear right away. But I have been to Syria 6 times, and I'm trying to convey the voices of the people I've met with. And so Doug mentioned that I first went to Syria in 2014. This is true. I went with an international peace delegation, which comprised people from, I can't remember how many countries, but from Europe, from India, from East Asia, from North America, etc. And the point was to go there and to hear Syrian voices. Even though the delegation was only there for 1 week, it was something. And we did go to Latakia, Homs, and of course Damascus. We met with internal opposition members, including members of the Communist Party, of the Kurdish Party, of feminist parties. And in Homs, we met with people who were involved in the reconciliation movement, which is a very important thing that is going on in Syria. Just basically, it's a movement to enable militants to lay down their weapons and return to civil society, and it's been very successful. In Latakia, no, I remember what I wanted to just make a note of. I have not been to Kasab, but in Latakia at an Armenian church, I did meet with people from Kasab. And Kasab came under Turkish and other forces' attack, and there were, people were run out of this historic Armenian village. So we did meet with people at this peace delegation. We did meet with people in Latakia who were from Kasab, but I haven't myself been to Kasab. Now, after the delegation left, I stayed on in Damascus for 2 weeks independently, funding myself, paying for my own hotel, obviously, in the old city of Damascus. Now, Doug mentioned mortars. In 2014 and 2015, mortars being fired from areas east of Damascus, so for example, Jobar, were heavy and almost on a daily basis. And they were hitting not only the old city, but other parts of Damascus. While the peace delegation was there in April 2014, a school called the El Manar Elementary School was hit, and 1 child was killed and over 60 were injured. And this was by a mortar fired from militants in Jobar. And so some of us went to the French hospital to see some of the victims, these children victims of this mortar attack. These are not isolated incidences, and just for example, this summer I was in Syria for 2 months, and in July, I believe the date was July 24th, again, a mortar fired from east of Damascus, from militant occupied areas, hit a restaurant called Qamar al-Sham restaurant, and the employees of the restaurant, I went there the following day, the employees told me that 11 people had been killed. These are all civilians. Most of them happened to be young women. And then I later met the sister of one of the women that was killed. She and her, the sister that was killed, her infant son was also killed. And basically they all had different stories of, because I'm sorry, just an aside, I went to, again, the French hospital to meet some of the victims, the injured, that had been injured in that attack. And a lot of their stories were like they went to meet their friends they hadn't seen in a while, they went to the restaurant just to have a drink, a cafe or a meal, and they were hit that this one mortar killed 11 people. And this is something that was happening daily in 2014 and 15 and prior, but I only had the experience from 2014. So that's to say that's an aspect of life we rarely hear about in the corporate media. And in fact, Lise Doucet, who reports for the BBC, was there in April 2014. She was at the same hospital, the French hospital, and if I remember, her report basically implied it was unknown where the mortar came from, therefore implying that perhaps it was the Syrian government had done it. This is a standard tactic, and hopefully later on I'll get into some of the media tactics regarding what's been happening in Syria. No, definitely I will. I just want to finish with some of my visits to Syria quickly. In May 2014, I had my visa in Syria had ended. I went to Lebanon. I applied for a new visa, a journalist visa, to go to Syria. I had to wait 35 days. So, for a Russian agent, this is a long wait. That's a bit of sarcasm. I did get the visa, and I went back for just, I think it was 8 days, 7 or 8 days. And in that period, I went back to Homs. I went to the old city, which in April 2014 had been secured. The militant factions that had been in the old city for years were transferred out in a deal, an agreement between the government and the militants. And I was able to speak with residents of the old city. And great, okay, I can start showing some photos. But just in summary of my trips to Syria, I went back in February with a delegation just for 2 days. A delegation led by former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark and members of the International Action Center and former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. And we met with different political and religious and civil society people. And then in December 2015, I went back for 1 week on a journalist visa, again going to Homs, and I'll get into this. And this summer I spent 2 months again on a journalist visa, and in October and November I spent 1 month, during which time I went to Aleppo twice, and during the summer I went to Aleppo twice. So I'm going to just get my computer and show some photos. Okay.
Video fill up.
Yes.
The stand.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, it's on this side. Thank you very much.
Like the ball.
I just do one thing. Is anybody an Ubuntu expert?
I have some experience. What do you need?
I need to pair the screen with the projector. I forget what I'm supposed to type
That's
in.
a function.
Yeah, one of the function keys. Should have
Be
a little
below.
screen on it.
Function.
Sorry about this.
May I?
I think you got it. Just keep going until you get it.
Yes, you may if you can. I'm sorry.
Go up.
Wait.
There you go.
Okay, I think maybe,
It might be split screen.
yeah, I think,
There you go.
all right. Thank you very much. Yes, this is going to be a bit disconcerting, but I'll do my best to keep it flowing. So basically, before I ever went to Syria, I did do a lot of reading and research, and in fact, I think in the audience there's at least one person who I spoke to, a Syrian Canadian, because as I said, prior to April 2014, I'd never been to Syria, but I had read a variety of sources, and I really stress a variety of sources because I don't expect you to believe everything I say. I corroborate everything I read with other people's testimonies and reports, etc., analysis. And so I met with people in Mississauga to hear what their opinion of what was happening was, and essentially it's the opinion that I later heard on repeated visits to Syria. In a nutshell, what I heard was in 2011, when protests started, we were optimistic because we wanted change. We wanted political change, and we wanted certain things in the government to change, like the corruption. Many Syrians have said they're very dissatisfied with the corruption in the government. And the people that I was speaking with, and then later in Syria, many visits, some of the people in Syria actually participated in the protests. They said we were happy because we thought this was going to bring the change and democracy that we wanted. And the people that I've spoken with, whether in Homs, in Latakia, in Damascus, said we very quickly realized that what we were seeing were not protests for democracy and political change. There were slogans of democracy and freedom, but there are also slogans of kill the Alawis and drive the Christians to Beirut. And again, this is something corroborated by people in Dara, and people in Homs, and people in Latakia, and people in Damascus. People in Aleppo, when I finally got there, said for the first year, the protests, the people in Aleppo didn't support the revolution, and it was in mid-2012 when militants occupied different areas of Aleppo. And Aleppo is predominantly Sunni. I can't give you the percentage, but it is a Sunni city. It's also the industrial hub of Syria, and that's an important point. But back to the initial, the version of events, basically the version of events has been there were protests, the government crushed the protests, and some people have different narratives. Some people maintain that the protests stayed nonviolent until late 2011 or early 2012. Others say, well, no, in mid-2011 they became armed. But people that I spoke with in Homs and in Dara said from the very beginning, amongst the protesters, not saying that every single protester, but amongst the protesters, there were people who were armed. Now, I'm going to get to Homs in a little bit. Actually, I'll do that. Right. No, I'll tell you. In Homs, basically, when I went in 2014, I met with a family called the Alchemist Family, and they lived in the old city of Homs. And they had stayed during the presence of the militants in the old city. They didn't want to leave their home because they were afraid it would be looted, as many were. And they said, basically, by the end of when the militants left Homs under this evacuation deal, they said that different militants had come and stolen every last morsel of food in their house, and that they had drastically lost a lot of weight. And they rejected the idea of a revolution. I also went to the church where Dutch priest Father Frans van der Loot had served for decades. And he was not pro-government nor pro-rebel, but he did say from the beginning, I saw armed protesters. And he was somebody who started writing about what he was seeing. In April 2014, he was assassinated. He was sat down in a chair and assassinated by one of the militants. So I mean, when I went to the old city of Homs, you know, I was able to speak with numerous families who spoke of the fact that the hell that they were living under the presence of the militants or the rebels. Of course, there are other voices, and I didn't see those other voices because, for one thing, in all the research I did prior to going to Syria, it struck me, as I think many of you hopefully realize, what's happened in Syria is a premeditated war on a sovereign nation. And this is documented in even US internal documents. It's documented by former US officials like General Wesley Clark saying, you know, Syria was one of many countries that was to be targeted, to be toppled, to be regime changed by the NATO alliance. You don't have to take my word for it. Look at the writings of Seymour Hersh. Look at the writings of Canadian Stephen Gowans. He has remarkably detailed articles documenting the lead up to the war on Syria and the historical context to what was happening in Syria prior to 2011. So anyway, with the knowledge that what was happening in Syria wasn't about, in my opinion, was not about human rights and freedom and democracy, and with the knowledge that the US has been sending weapons and money to armed opposition for years, and they admit it, and they even admit in their own internal documents that they foresaw the rise of an Islamist state and that would be beneficial in the regime change operation. For me personally, I did not feel it necessary to go to areas occupied by militants because their narrative is largely sectarian and not one that I endorse. I was more interested to hear what the Syrian people had to say, so that's why I mean, to be honest, if I was able to, for example, sneak in through Turkey, which I wouldn't do, but if I did, and embed myself with militants who are affiliated with Al-Qaeda, I probably would not be here. Anyway, all to say, what I'm going to show you is based on what Syrians told me. I maintain I'm not an expert, I don't pretend to be, I just want to convey what I've seen in Syria. So this is the highway leading to Aleppo. In July 2016, I first went. There is a main highway, but it goes through Idlib in an area that is controlled by militant factions. So for years, the only way to access Aleppo was through the road called Kanasser. And it's quite a detour, but and it's dangerous at parts because some kilometers away you have ISIS factions who would at nighttime lay landmines on the highway and causing it to be dangerous for people, civilians and buses and trucks and transport traveling the highway. But it was the only way in. You can see a bit of the wreckage on either side from attacks by ISIS and other militant factions. Oh dear. Okay, I'm going to need some tech help because apparently this isn't going to pair correctly. Can somebody help me?
I don't use this system. What is it that you're trying to do?
Well, it's Ubuntu.
Is there a folder in which these files are stored?
Yes, but the thing is, there's a way of pairing it, and people usually do it for me, so I'm not sure how to pair it to get the whole folder to show on the screen.
Now the
Usually, if I have this first photo up, then the next flow, but it's not doing that.
okay, so we have it shows up there. If we
I'm
have
just going to unplug this for 1 second while I do this. If I have to, I'll do it without photos, that's fine, but I really think it would be strong to show you some of the photos and testimonies.
of course. This is the folder then, right? And they're all in a set.
Yes.
If you hit enter on it, it'll probably show it on the.
No, I've tried that. What it does is it shows only on my screen, not there.
تعرف Ubuntu, right? Maybe you can try.
Yeah, function key. Eventually you'll get what's on here is up there.
Yeah, we just have to change this to mode.
Are you sure with Ubuntu?
Yeah,
Sure, if it's doing it.
I mean, if I absolutely
yeah,
had to.
because you were changing things when you hit function.
Yeah, but it wasn't changing the order one.
No, it's
Okay.
the screen setup. So you plug in the function
What the-
F4, and you see that up there. Wait.
زحمة شوي.
Yeah, it's not doing it. That one I'm very sorry. I can do this without notes, but I have some testimonies I wanted you to hear because I do think it's important to hear Syrian voices. gonna give? Thank you. That's the one. Thank you so much.
There you go. Good stuff. Yes, that's it. Keep this.
Thank you so much. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah.
And then see if you hit next, does it? That's getting you the, if you hit next, does it?
Yeah, just. Okay,
There you
thank
go.
you. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. Entering Aleppo through Ramoussi, there was a district called Sheikh Said, which was occupied by militant factions, and it was very dangerous for civilians and trucks and anybody on the narrow road going along Ramoussi to enter Aleppo. And so there were barrels and sand embankments, earth embankments to protect from snipers. When I was in Aleppo, I met with a man named Dr. Nabil Antaki. He's one of Aleppo's over 4,100 registered and active doctors, according to the Aleppo Medical Association. And that's an important point because later, when I get into some of the media truths about Syria, they were always talking about last doctors in Aleppo. And this is because they essentially were not they'd erased the greater Aleppo population of 1.5 million people, and they were only talking about eastern areas of Aleppo occupied by militant factions. So Dr. Nabil Antaki said his own brother was assassinated some years prior while going along Ramoussi Road. And in fact, after my July visit, I read on the state media that a woman had been shot by a sniper traveling along that road. So I mentioned the Aleppo Medical Association. I also was interested in addition to knowing how many doctors and how many specialists, and the number of specialists was 800, and again, referring to how the corporate media was talking about Aleppo, we heard last pediatrician, last specialist, and again, they were not talking about Greater Aleppo. And in all regards, Greater Aleppo was disappeared. The suffering that they had endured for years by the presence of militants in eastern and northern areas. One point that Dr. Nabil made was, well, and I'm going to quote him, since July 2012, the main area of Aleppo receives every day mortars, bombs, and gas canisters. Now, the gas canisters are basically cooking gas canisters, which have been refitted with a tail and stuffed with explosives and shot by something called a hell cannon. And these, there are varying sizes, just as small and large sizes of cooking gas canisters, and even water heaters were used, according to local residents. So he was saying, you know, on a daily basis, these bombs and canisters sent by the rebels on civilians living in Aleppo. Here you have human damage more than there, but less physical destruction, because here we're receiving mortars and gas canister bombs. If a mortar hits the building, it might make a hole the size of a window, but also kill 5 people at once. In the part of Aleppo